Hello, and welcome to Bad Art, a podcast about the politics of art in the 21st century. I'm Colin McLaughlin Alcock,
I'm Marielle Grushko.
and today we want to take a close look at the political art of Banksy. Banksy, of course, is an internationally famous graffiti artist who has often attracted attention by taking political stances in his work. In particular, once we introduce Banksy a little bit, we're going to be talking about several trips which Banksy has made over the last 20 years to Palestine, where he's attempted to use graffiti art as a tool of solidarity building. His work has both been praised for calling attention to the conditions in Palestine, but also critiqued for sometimes taking an ironic pose that makes the Palestinian struggle into something of a joke, or for overwriting Palestinian voices. And so today we're going to take a closer look at Banksy's work in Palestine and evaluate the challenges and potential of artistic solidarity through his example. So to get started, I mean, most of our listeners probably know who Banksy is, but we should still do a brief bio. Banksy is one of the most famous graffiti artists in the world, probably the most famous and probably by a substantial margin, I would say. He's got mainstream fame. You know, he's a news figure, a figure of a celebrity gossip, even though his actual name is at least theoretically anonymous. I mean, I think people know who he is, but he's maintained this brand of no one actually knows who Banksy is. So he's one of these artists who began gaining fame and notoriety in the early 2000s, or one of these graffiti artists who began getting famous in the early 2000s, together with someone like Shepard Fairey, who wound up doing an advertising campaign for Obama, but who earlier was known for these sticker campaigns and other graphic images, and JR. So there's a cohort of graffiti artists who got famous in the early 2000s, and he's sort of the figurehead of that. This is when graffiti went from illegal and underground to mainstream. So it's worth noting that all three of the artists I mentioned, who I think are the most famous, are white, and yet graffiti culture has roots in black communities and hip hop. So there is a transition from it being a black art form to one that white people are getting rich off of. Banksy himself, he's got an iconic style, so it's mostly black and white. It's done with stencils, and it's ironic or sarcastic. So in his Palestine work, for example, there's a painting of like a dove of peace holding an olive branch, but wearing a bulletproof vest, or a child patting down a soldier. So these sort of inversions of what you expect to see as a kind of joke is, I guess, what you would say his style is. Would you agree with that sort of description?
I guess I don't know if I would call that a joke.
Okay.
I think there's a type of humor in it, but I guess those specific examples that you gave to me feel more like an inversion that is supposed to make us question things by putting them into this juxtaposition, right?
Yeah.
So we have this taken for granted idea of peace, but what does it mean to have peace while wearing a bulletproof vest, right?
Yeah.
Um, or the idea of a child patting down a soldier is a really good example of what in literary analysis is known as the carnivalesque, right?
Mm.
So just this literal turning upside down or inversion of what we would normally hope to see. And so, yes, the carnivalesque is humorous, but it's not a joke that exists for its own sake. The idea is that it's a type of upending that challenges the established social order. And so I think if I'm trying to read Banksy's work generously, I would say it's not so much a joke as it is kind of a clever inversion, wisdom as spoken by a fool.
I appreciate that. So that is definitely the more generous reading, but I think that that goes in line with what Banksy supporters would say that he's doing is using an inversion of a kind to make you think. One of the critiques that I was referencing in getting ready for this episode is something by Dan Brooks called Banksy and the Problem with Sarcastic Art, where he basically says it has the form of a joke, but ultimately is very shallow. Gets this inversion, and everyone recognizes, oh, haha, a dove in a bulletproof vest. You you recognize it, so you feel good about yourself for recognizing it, but it doesn't lead you anywhere beyond sort of a sarcastic recognition. So that would be the critical side, but I think it is nice to have that positive side of, well, it does actually make you reflect and think, I didn't expect to see this. Where can I go with this inversion?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point about the shallowness of the inversion, that maybe the response that you imagine from the audience is something along the lines of, haha, I understood that reference, right?
Yeah,
Which is a pretty satisfying response. I do kind of wonder how much of the perception that this is shallow comes from people not taking graffiti very seriously as an art form.
that's also possible. And certainly Banksy is the person who projects it into, or one of the handful of people who project it into being an art form that is taken seriously. And so there is a lingering discreditedness of it. It's unprofessional, it's trite, it's made by kids, it's made by black kids. So all of these things that separate it from the elite mainstream art world continue to devalue it from a certain perspective, even as, Banksy's works are selling for record-breaking million-dollar prices or multi-million dollar prices. So Banksy begins making his name in the early 2000s. It seems like he began doing graffiti art in the 1990s, but begins getting famous in the early 2000s through a series of gallery exhibitions that he does with other up-and-coming brand name graffiti artists, especially Shepard Fairey. So between 2002 and 2004, he has major exhibitions in Los Angeles, London, and Sydney, Australia, and these sort of put him on the map. And then, especially through the LA engagements, he starts to get, celebrity attention. So in 2006, he sells a painting or an artwork to Christina Aguilera for 25,000 pounds, which is, roughly, I didn't do the math, but 40 or $50,000. And the celebrity attention really spirals his worth. So soon he's selling works for 50,000 pounds, then 100,000 pounds, and then six figures or more.
I love the idea that Christina Aguilera was the trailblazer here. She led the other celebrities to become interested in this art form. That's so interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I mean, I don't have the full breakdown of who's always bought it, but it's a real milestone that she paid this amount of money and her attention gave it that kind of valuation. Banksy himself has always been sort of standoffish or uneasy with this fame and fortune. So some of his early responses early on his website after a big sale, he changed the logo on the website to "I can't believe you morons actually buy this shit."
That's actually one of my favorite Banksy moments.
Yeah,
That's great. Yeah. I maybe we could say it's a little bit shallow, but it's also pretty funny.
fair enough. He does that sort of again in 2010 with his documentary Exit Through the Gift Shop, which is basically mocking Los Angeles art buyers. So the basic story is that one of Banksy's hanger-ons uses Banksy's fame to become famous himself, but as an entirely mediocre and derivative artist who makes crap. And he hosts a big art sale and makes millions of dollars based on his association with Banksy and people buying these artworks, which are trite. So the basic point of the documentary is art buyers don't know how to distinguish between the serious, ironic art and this imitator who is just hanging on the coattails of fame to get famous. And it's really more of a knock at the art world than at the hanger-on.
Yeah, it's been a minute since I have seen Exit Through the Gift Shop, but that's how I remember it too, that it's really making fun of this lack of discernment that the art buyers have
Right.
and kind of the way that these hype cycles work.
Yeah. And then his latest is I think 2018. He had this painting that sold at auction for 18.5 million pounds and then immediately self-destructed. So it was had a shredder built in, and as soon as the sale was completed, the painting shredded itself. But of course, the shredded painting is still worth, millions and millions of dollars. So one other thing that I wanted to say about the shreddy painting is that obviously it works to Banksy's advantage. Like it enhances his image to be standoffish in this way. It doesn't destroy his career, but it boosts his mystique. And so I don't know that the question of sincerity is very interesting, but like there's no efficacy in being hostile to the buyers. It instead is something that enhances his brand. And he is certainly very careful about his branding and marketing of himself.
Yeah, and to that point about branding and marketing, you were talking earlier about how Banksy's identity is now known, but it doesn't matter at all because what matters is Banksy, the brand.
Right.
So that's been very successful to the point where one of those that initial mystique that came from not knowing who he is, that mystique has managed to withstand his identity becoming known, which I think that, when Christina Aguilera bought the artwork for 25,000 pounds, I don't think we could have predicted that it would work
Yeah.
out that way.
Yeah, I think that's true. So the other thing to know about Banksy is he occasionally does these large stunts. So I guess the shredding painting is a kind of a stunt, but he also got a lot of attention for his 2015 art installation called Dismal Land, which is a play on Disneyland. And it's a fake amusement park, but
Hmm.
it's a depressing amusement park. And the attendants and security guards are all frowning, like they're paid to frown the entire day. The fountain in the middle is a police water cannon. Everything's gloomy looking. There's instead of Cinderella, Cinderella's carriage has crashed, and she's surrounded by paparazzi, like Princess Di. So there's sort of this grotesque, I think carnivalesque, I guess makes sense here. And so that was a surprise stunt. He opened it by surprise, and there it was in England, and it attracted a lot of attention. And he sort of does big scale stunts like this. And then on the flip side, he also was committed to refugee awareness through Dismal Land and promised to reuse the materials to provide housing to refugees who are stranded in Calais in France.
Hmm.
So I wasn't able to track down whether that actually happened, but there was this idea that this was going to be a material benefit to refugees. The installation also did have like refugee stuff where you were supposed to
Hmm.
remote control pilot a boat full of refugees across some sort of amusement park pond, but the remotes kept failing, which we can ask questions about. It is sort of, I would again say this potentially is making a joke at the refugees' expense, even though it is attempting to raise awareness of refugees drowning in the Mediterranean Sea.
Yeah. It's, I mean, just to make this clear, because I don't know how much play this got in the US at the time, but 2015 was the peak of what was known as the refugee
Right.
crisis in the European Union. France was one of the major countries that was receiving a lot of refugees. A lot of these refugees were Syrian fleeing the civil war, but from other parts of the Middle East and North Africa as well. Part of the kind of post-Arab Spring upheaval led to these large numbers of refugees having to leave their countries. Um, and there was, footage I was living in Spain at the time, and there was footage every day of refugees trying to get around Europe, of migrant boats capsizing in the Mediterranean. I remember there was like cell phone donation drive, so you could donate your cell phone so that it could be used by migrants, by refugees to to get to where they needed to go. And yeah, I guess I didn't know about Dismal Land prior to you telling me about it. And so my immediate thought when you told me about it is, okay, but Dismal Land is clearly just trying, like the joke is not so much an inversion. It's the joke is this is how things actually are.
Yeah.
Ha ha ha. Everything actually is this terrible. Like the fountain is just a police water cannon. You can't get the refugees across the pond safely. Yeah. So I don't know who the joke is on. I don't know if there is a joke.
Yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, I don't necessarily know either. I do remember this happening, and it was just a huge spectacle. It got hundreds of thousands of visitors in the brief period of time it was open. But yeah, I mean, this is actually what that article on the limits of irony was about Dismal Land, and it's just sort of like, what is the joke? You're not sure, it's a
Yeah.
statement, it's a spectacle, it's strange, it's upsetting, but what is it trying to say? What does it want you to do? What is the greater depth becomes a harder question to answer.
I might throw in another lens that we could use to think about what is Banksy up to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder what if the point is just to defamiliarize us with the world as it is?
Well, sure. But then we have to ask the question to like what end? So it is again that we recognize that this is unfamiliar, but is recognition it? You know what I mean?
Well, but not so much that we recognize that it's unfamiliar as defamiliarizing what we take for granted, right?
To provoke the imagination in a sort of dissensus kind of way.
Right, right, exactly. That's what I'm thinking about is okay, people in France had gotten so used to the refugee crisis, right? To seeing these refugees. The world had gotten so used to it. And so, one thing that you could say about Dismal Land is that it takes that situation that everyone has come to take for granted and hangs a sign on it, basically, that says this is in fact dismal.
Well, so that I mean that's an interesting, it's not what I had planned, but that's an interesting transition into talking about his excursions to Palestine because there's a longer running question in Palestinian art of is the point to call attention? Like Palestinian art started out in response to the claim that this is a land without a people, right? So Palestinian art said, no, we're here. We've got a rich history, and we're going to illustrate that and show you that we have a rich culture. And at some point, everyone has to acknowledge, yes, Palestinians are there. Yes, they're being treated as second-class citizens or worse. Yes, they are, suffering in this situation. And everyone's aware, and yet artists keep attempting to call awareness to something that everyone knows and it doesn't do anything, right? So there is this critique in Palestinian art that awareness is ineffective. And I think it hinges on that famous, Stokely Carmichael quote, like in order to provoke the conscience, your enemy has to have a conscience. But like, you know,
Yeah.
there is a limit to awareness that
Yeah.
is at work in this context as well. And I think in the refugee crisis also, like everyone knew the refugees were there, but people weren't moved. You know what I mean?
I remember at the time people also discussed the refugee crisis as an example of the limits of humanism.
Right,
So there were all of these efforts to insist that the refugees are human beings, right? With a right to dignity. I think you could say the same thing about efforts to raise awareness about Palestine, right? That the implicit argument is these are human beings with a right to life, dignity, and self-determination, and no one cares,
right.
right? And I think one possible interpretation is no one cares because the category of human is limited and doesn't include these people.
Yeah. I think that's a reasonable interpretation, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, so I wonder if, yes, it makes sense to talk about it in terms of awareness of that artistic project of Palestinian art. We could talk about it in terms of awareness, but I think there's some value in highlighting that the whole logic of awareness is tied to this logic of humanism. And the humanist project was really successful throughout the 20th century, right? In wide swaths of the world, not just in Europe, right? There
Right.
were a lot of successes at staking a claim on shared humanity and getting rights and life through that claim making, right? But there's something that has broken down, I think, more recently.
I would think so.
Yeah.
Maybe it's worth, I mean, so we'll have to decide later whether we want to keep this in or not, but maybe it's worth here, like there is an alternative, and so one of the things that Palestinian artists have done is say, well, how can art actually intervene in the conditions? And so, one of the things you have the Rawak Biennale in Palestine, most of which is centered around restoring historic Palestinian buildings that are at risk of being demolished or decaying and turning them into cultural centers. So actually building like cultural centers that people can live in and use as an artistic project that brings in funds and international support and resources. Or some colleagues of mine in Jordan did this thing called The River Has Two Banks, where they would invite Palestinian artists to do work in Jordan, and Jordanian artists would go and do work in Palestine. But it was explicitly as about building mobilizable relationships between Jordan and Palestine, which had been severed. And so there's like an idea of actually doing things with art as opposed to simply hoping art will spur the conscience of the observer.
Right. And what's really striking about this alternative that you're describing is that the audience, the imagined audience of the art is so different.
Right.
So it's not art meant to persuade outsiders. It's art for the insiders themselves, right? It's art
Yeah.
for Palestinians. It's art to help them in their lives or to build relationships to other people rather than being art that goes out into the world in search of a sympathetic and receptive audience that is going to be persuaded into something by the
Yeah.
art.
So Banksy made his first trip to Palestine in 2005 when he painted several murals on the separation wall, which was then being built between Israel and the West Bank, and also painted several other paintings around the area. We should give a little background on what the separation wall was and or is and why he targeted this as an object of intervention. So early 2000s, the relationship between Israel and Palestine was in a state of flux. So 1993 to 2000 is known as the Oslo period. It's a period during which the Oslo Accords were expected to lead towards a two-state solution. This was the result of the first Palestinian Intifada, which kicked off in the 1980s and was basically a general strike, which withdrew economic support or economic participation from Israel and relied on a lot of mutual aid and protest. And also, Israel's violent response to the protests generated a lot of international outrage, weakening Israel's position until it was compelled to negotiate and reach a settlement.
Which is a great example of when that humanist appeal was still working,
Yeah, yeah, I would agree.
right? It's telling that the first Intifada led to this wave of international solidarity and support for Palestine that generated the pressure that led to the Oslo Accords.
Yeah. And so the Oslo Accords were flawed from the beginning. They didn't have answers for what happens to Jerusalem, what happens to Palestinians' right to return, what happens to Israeli settlements, and many other issues that were sort of deferred to be talked about later and basically never got solved. Also, at the same time, during that Oslo period, the Israeli government sought ways to undermine Palestinian self-determination, both by further building out settlements into the West Bank, which disrupt Palestinian life, but also by beginning to shift the labor alliance. So Israel was reliant on Palestinian workers from the West Bank, especially as manual laborers, but they began shifting to importing manual labor from South Asia to weaken their reliance on Palestine and being able to cut off from Palestinian society entirely, which hadn't been the case before. And so in 2000, the the peace talks broke down. Those issues remained unresolved. Palestinians began protesting against the failures of the negotiation and also against provocations from a right-wing Israeli politician named Ariel Sharon. Israeli police began shooting the protesters, and this rose into armed conflict, which became known as the Second Intifada. And, a resumption of conflict, a failure of the Oslo Accords. There's a lot of disagreement on whether the two-state solution was ever a viable solution or whether the Oslo Accords were ever realistic. But certainly by the early 2000s, they had failed. And what was left was a right-wing Israeli politician in power who gained power by sort of provoking Palestinians and making use of these provocations to justify military suppression. One of the things that he did upon assuming power was to announce a project of building a wall between Israel and the West Bank. Ostensibly, this was for security, to respond to a series of bombing attacks and suicide bombings. And ostensibly, it was built along the Green Line, which is the 1967 border between Israel and the West Bank. Is not actually built along the Green Line. So at many places, it incurs quite deeply into Palestinian territory, both to swing around settlements, but also to seize farmland and water resources. And so there are many people who describe the building of the wall as a deliberate attempt to choke Palestinian life together with the construction of military checkpoints and other military strategies that constrain Palestinian life, make it harder for Palestinians to live in the West Bank. The International Court of Justice said that the wall was illegal in 2004 and that Israel had to stop construction and take it down. Of course, they didn't. And it became an object of protest, both in Palestine, where it was a sustained site of regular protest. If you've ever seen the movie Five Broken Cameras, that's a movie about protests against the building of the wall. But also in the US, where, like on college campuses, Students for Justice for Palestine would build mock walls as an illustration of the brutality of the occupation. I think it's important that this is still a time when Trump hadn't risen to power yet. The Berlin Wall was still pretty high in the public imagination. And so this was quite obviously a symbol of oppression in the public imagination.
Yes, I was in high school at the time that the wall was being built. And what I recall from that time period is that, I was a Jewish high schooler and it was very obviously an outrage, right? It
Right.
was very obviously discriminatory, dehumanizing. And, I think that it wasn't really controversial among social justice activists in the United States or even among liberal Jews in the United States at the time to say building a wall between Israelis and Palestinians in the West Bank is wrong. And it's wrong to put human beings behind a wall as if they were in the zoo. That was
Yeah.
pretty uncontroversial at the time. And it makes me very sad to think about how 20 years on, that's something that we imagine that we need to put into words because otherwise it's like, okay, there's another wall. Sure.
It is sort of an illustration of just how far we've gone in those 20 years that walls have become sort of an accepted feature of international politics, whereas they were really, I don't know the word, they were seen as gross. They were seen as
Yeah.
oppressive.
It was seen as like completely beyond the pale, I
Right.
think, for Israel to be building this wall.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's why Banksy goes, is because this is an object of protest and he thinks he can, I don't want to speculate on what he thinks, but that's why Banksy goes. This wall is an object of protest. He can contribute to that protest by drawing attention to the wall with paintings. And he makes a series of playful paintings or playful murals on the wall as it's being built. I think the most famous is there's this Victorian looking girl in pigtails holding some balloons and sort of floating up over the wall. There are also several areas where like the wall is being ripped open and you see a tropical beach in the distance behind it. There's an escalator going up over the wall. So these are the sorts of things that he's playing with and imagining in that first visit to Palestine.
Sorry, just to say like the tropical beach, is that a reference to the student protests in France in 1968?
You know, it could be under the pavement of beach, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. That's okay. That's kind of cool.
It's worth looking to
Interesting.
see. I don't know, but that's a good reference. I mean, I should say like when it happened, I really liked the girl with the balloons. I was like, "Oh, that's clever. That calls attention. It's hopeful."
Yeah. I remember feeling that way too, that there was so much hope in these images that he drew on the wall, right?
Yeah.
That, this wasn't about the humor of the
Right.
inversion, at least to me. It was about the idea that even though this wall was being built, that didn't have to be the way that things would be, and that there was hope that people would be able to move beyond the wall, move through the wall.
Yeah. Don't have time to get into it super far, but you're reminding me also of this film that came out around that time called Omar, which is a Palestinian made film, in which one of the things that happens is that characters go up and over the wall several times, like subverting its existence by moving across it back and forth, which of course is also very dangerous. And people get killed attempting that all the time. But the idea that we can overcome this was a powerful one in Palestinian circles as well.
And again, I think what you said earlier about how the memory of the Berlin Wall was still so alive for
Yeah.
people at the time, that's really important, right? So this idea of people risking their lives to go over an unjust wall, this was an image and a story that people already knew from the
Yeah.
Berlin Wall and the history of people crossing it. And it was very straightforward. Going over this wall is liberation, is people asserting their humanity in the face of systems that would erase it.
Yeah. So there are a few things that we should say here. The first is that these images have been critiqued for being very European coded. The girl holding the balloons is quite obviously white European.
That's so true.
And that's an interesting thing to say about art that's in Palestine. It's clear that it is a white image being projected onto Palestine, which has a certain problematics to it. The second thing is there's this question, should you be painting on the wall at all? So in her book Backstories, Amal Bashara quotes Banksy from something he wrote, noting that Palestinians asked him not to paint on the wall. So there's this passage from Banksy. There's an old man who says, "You paint the wall, you make it look beautiful." Banksy says, "Thanks." The old man says, "We don't want it to be beautiful. We hate this wall. Go home." I mean, again, you don't have to go home. Like, you don't have to listen to every critic, but it's important to note that this criticism is there, that making the wall beautiful helps make it permanent, and leaving it ugly is something that at least some Palestinians were demanding at the time.
And I think the idea is to leave the wall ugly lays bare for everyone to see the ugliness of it, right?
Yeah,
That they don't want the wall to be dressed up as something other than what it is. And maybe if we read that the quote of the man who said this to Banksy, we could read it a little bit metaphorically too, in which case we could interpret him as saying, don't try to pretty up the situation
right.
by implying that there's some hope here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the third thing to say about this trip is that he's one of the first international artists to use the wall as a canvas, but he helps to make it into a graffiti destination. So today, the wall is covered with graffiti. Graffiti artists travel internationally to come and make their own critical art on the wall. It's also heavily covered with art from international solidarity organizations. I guess art's the wrong word. A lot of it is text that's not artistic. So they'll paint like, you know, stop the wall or peace or something like that. So Amal Bashara also notes that this international cohort of artists and messengers and organizations drowns out Palestinian voices. And so when you go to the wall, a lot of what you see is international artists. And even more to the point, when journalists take pictures of the wall, which is a powerful symbol, so it appears a lot in newspapers, they take pictures of portions that have been painted on by international artists and organizations, which appeal
Mm.
and are easily intelligible to American or European audiences, but which are not Palestinian voices. And so there's another way that Palestinians get cut out of the conversation about
Right.
what's happening in Palestine.
I think that's so interesting, going back to what you were telling me earlier about how Palestinian art started as an effort by Palestinians to raise awareness of their existence on their land. It sure sounds like what you end up getting at the separation wall is third parties, not Palestinians, raising awareness. But if originally the idea of raising awareness as practiced by Palestinian artists was they were the artists raising awareness of their own humanity, now you have other people making art to point to what's happening in Palestine. And yes, part of their message is Palestinians are human beings, but you no longer have that direct linkage where it's the person who is claiming humanity through their own production of
Right.
art, right?
That's really important.
I'm not an art historian, but what I know of art history is that part of the point of artistic production in contemporary art, at least, is the being able to claim your humanness through the art that you yourself produce, not art that someone else makes on your behalf.
Yeah. And, it also is quite different in its messaging. So Bashara notes that international, it varies, but it can be pretty abstract, like notions of peace, and harmony that don't really engage the conditions of oppression at all. Compare it to Palestinian things that say, like, Jerusalem is ours, freedom for our prisoners, the wall will not stand. So these very direct demands versus abstract ideas of peace. JR, the graffiti artist, got a lot of heat for an art project he did on the wall where he painted, Israeli and Palestinian people side by side looking at each other as if all people need to do is look each other in the eye and the problem is solved. So very naive, right?
Right.
Which gets more attention than these Palestinian messages.
Right. And so, okay, that's something that I didn't understand before, that Palestinian artists are still putting their own art on the wall and their own messages on the wall, it sounds like. Yeah, and it's just that because there's this international art that is maybe more palatable to people, less challenging. Therefore, when images are made of the wall, those are the images that get made, or of those portions with the less confrontational messages.
At least the majority of what circulates in the United States and Europe are photos of the wall as decorated by other Europeans.
Hmm, that's very interesting.
So Banksy returns to the West Bank in 2017 to build the quote walled off hotel. That's a play on Waldorf, but it is a luxury hotel abutting the separation wall in Bethlehem. And it's a stunt, so it's built in secret. It opens all of a sudden. No one knew Banksy was making this hotel until it opens with a surprise. And the stunt is, oh, how'd he do that? But it aims to promote graffiti tourism to Bethlehem and be an economic benefit to the Palestinians living in the immediate area of the hotel. Since it's opened, it's had 140,000 visitors. The hotel itself is classic Banksy. So the decor is security cameras, slingshots. There's Banksy art posted up. There's a mural of Palestinians and Israelis having a pillow fight. There's a hot tub made out of a water barrel that's been shot, so bullet holes sort of spill into the luxury hotel room, and famously a statue of a monkey doorman who's dropping his bags as he rushes into the hotel. And there's a museum of the Balfour Declarations are really focused on the British role. Banksy is British in creating the crisis as it exists now.
So I guess I wondered if we might want to talk a little bit about our own reactions to this art piece before we get into the critique. Just like, Colin, what do you think of this art?
It's hard for me to separate it from the critique for me. So I was in Jordan at the time this opened, and the critique that I'm going to reference when we talk about critiques is a critique written by my colleague Shrew Karb. So I saw it, pretty right away. And so my reaction to this was sort of shaped by the critique from the beginning, as opposed to the first stuff. The first stuff I
Right.
just saw, but this I encountered via Palestinians who were upset about it.
Okay. Interesting. I mean, yeah, I don't know. So I know about the existence of the hotel, but I don't think I'd ever seen any images of what is inside of it or what it looks like. And my first reaction is that a lot of this seems to be in really poor taste.
Yeah.
It just, to me, feels really night and day with the art from 2005. It's clearly much more aggressive, but not in a way that it feels, I don't know, it doesn't feel helpful, right? It feels hurtful. The only part that made me go, oh, okay, maybe there's something there is the exhibit focused on the Balfour
Right.
Declaration. I like the idea that as a British artist, Banksy is not just acknowledging like his own positionality, but also using that as a way to draw attention to his own country's role, hopefully draw the attention of other British people to what they could do, their historical wrongs and maybe their leverage toward fixing this situation. So that was the only part where I was like, okay, maybe it's not all terrible. This seems like one good thing that came out of this, but it just, from your description, it sounds really awful.
That's sort of how I feel about it too. Let me show you, just to give you like an image. This is from a Channel 4 documentary on the Waldorf Hotel.
This one has been explained to us by our Palestinian hosts, that this is a very symbolic image around the hot tub because in the Second Intifada in 2002, Israeli soldiers were alleged to have deliberately fired on water tanks to empty them, to make people suffer. That's certainly what people claim here happened. And as you move out towards the balcony, is this the worst view in the world? Somehow, through its cheek and humour, the hotel takes what is normally a distressing scene and makes it compelling.
I think it gives you a sense of bad taste. Here's this
Yes.
hot water tank as a symbol of Palestinian suffering, but it's been converted into a luxury that a European visitor can bathe in.
It does give me a stronger sense of the bad taste. It also helps me to understand better that the bad taste is extremely deliberate.
Right.
And so that the shot right after the hot tub where they show like, is this the worst view in the world? Right, helped me understand clearly that's by design that, you exit this pretty luxurious looking hotel interior and find yourself faced with that view, right?
And the view is specifically looking over the wall into Israeli construction.
And it's, clearly, or I don't know if clearly, but it seems to me like what he was going for is these wealthy international, highly mobile tourists who would come to stay at the Banksy Hotel as part of their travels through an international graffiti art circuit would be deliberately confronted by the ugliness of the whole situation, the ugliness of their own actions, their own complicity. And so it helps me understand the point of all the bad taste. But again, it goes to this question of audience.
Yeah. So that is a nice segue into the critiques. It's been described by various people as poverty tourism or apartheid tourism, or is Banksy building his fame off of Palestinian struggle and suffering? So these would be some of the most common critical comments about this is that it's not only in very bad taste, but it's really disrespectful to Palestinians. And as I was mentioning, my colleague Shrew Harb wrote an article really quickly after this happened, and it's called "Don't Confuse Me with the Monkey." And she describes how she went to visit the hotel. She's ambivalent, like she gives pluses and minuses to it. She acknowledges that calling attention to Palestine is a valuable thing, but she also says, I'm going to read here, I am greeted by a Palestinian man dressed in the costume of a British doorman. I ask him if I can take his photograph. He responds with a yes, but that he does not want to be framed with the now famous sculpture of a monkey wearing a bellhop's uniform at the entrance. I ask him why. He says, I don't want people to confuse me with the monkey. Harb continues, there is an underlying discomfort to the Waldorf Hotel in that Palestinians are essentially performing their struggle within the pretext of a joke.
Wow. That last sentence is so powerful.
Yeah. It's really bleak and it hits and it's hard to see it any other way once that's what's raised to you.
Yes, absolutely. Even the idea, even if you lop off that last clause in the context of a joke, right?
Right.
Even if you just have the first part that Palestinians are performing their struggle in this hotel, most of the problems with it are still right there staring you in the face,
Yeah.
right?
So, and that's, a critical view. There are Palestinians who support it. I mean, obviously there is work to be had in and around it. This is Hossam Zomlis, presidential advisor in the Palestinian administration, talking about why he supports the hotel. And this is from that same Channel 4 documentary.
The one thing I loved most about this place is how do you transform conflict areas, this very absolute situation of despair and suffering, sheer human suffering, into a haven of art and music and luxury and tourism and information. This is, to say the least, transformational in every sense. I have just seen it, so I might be at the effect of what I have seen, but transformational because we Palestinians have had a long history of art and culture. Art has been an integral part of our national identity of who we are for millennia, for generations. And this is exactly why we have been able to steadfast and remain rooted in our land. It's art, it's our songs and music. To see Palestinian art elevated to such a global stage is definitely the right place. And also to see this openness of this place. This place is open to everybody. We need to have not only British kids, but international and Israeli kids to come and see the real story, not from a very confrontationalist approach, but from a subtle approach. Come and live the reality.
We should say they're sitting in the hotel bar while they talk. It could be a fancy hotel bar anywhere, basically.
Yeah, it could be anywhere. And that's what this presidential advisor loves so much about it.
It's weird to me, the he talks about how important art is to Palestinian struggle and identity, but he conflates Banksy with Palestinian art in weird ways to me and Palestinian history. Like, come and see what Palestinians can accomplish, but this is a museum of Banksy. Do you know what I mean? It's a weird conflation.
I think maybe one way that I can understand that kind of, it's like a context collapse, right?
Yeah.
There's Palestinian art and there's Banksy, and he's just kind of saying these are the same thing. I think one way that I can understand that is that homeless is really craving this kind of international exchange, right?
Yeah.
Exchange between Palestine and the world, right? And you can, I can totally understand that after having been isolated, not just by the wall, but also by travel restrictions, by being culturally painted as quote unquote terrorists, as not worthy of belonging in a human community, I can understand why the idea that Palestinian art exists alongside Banksy's art and that they're together and that all of these, he says he wants not just British visitors, but
Yeah.
international visitors and Israeli visitors. You can really see how he's craving that kind of exchange where Palestinians will be equals alongside all of the world's people. And so I think if I'm reading that conflation of the Palestinian art with Banksy's art generously, that's kind of where I end up, is that it's about Palestinians being on equal footing with Banksy. And so it's sort of it's like he's wrapping his arm around Banksy so that he can bring the Palestinian artists alongside.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think the point about openness, bringing people, he is definitely excited that people are coming. Come and see who we are, what we can do. I mean, that's a long-standing desire. So, one other thing to say about the hotel. So, it's had 140,000 visitors. It closed after October 7th, 2023. So, in response to that attack, and it does raise questions for me, like what does your solidarity mean if you close when things get tough? I mean, I don't know what to make of that, but it is a thing worth noting.
Yeah, I was going to ask you earlier what was going on in 2017 politically in terms of geopolitics. Was this a period of time where some version of normalization was on the horizon? Like what was the context in which Banksy made this hotel?
Um, I mean, it is sort of the long-running prequel to Now, where so there's a series of smaller scale Israeli assaults on everything. So, you have several attacks on Gaza, which are shorter than the present one, largely because international leaders didn't support it. And you have like the 2006 invasion of Lebanon. So just several repeated small but quite disastrous offensives. It's post Second Intifada. I think Palestinian hopelessness is high. It's before the Great March of Return. So in 2020, Gazans began attempting to march across the border to return to their homes that they'd been expelled from, and they were shot and prevented from doing that. But that moment sparked a turn in Palestinian politics where there was something called the Unity Intifada. I don't know that it ever actually happened, but there was a growing sense that different segments of Palestinian society were seeing their struggle united in a way it hadn't been in a long time. So Palestinians living in Jerusalem or Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinians living in refugee camps, Palestinians living in Gaza, all felt like it was time for them to work together to sort of push the matter forward and felt like they could for a brief moment. But this is before that. So this is a weird sort of bleak moment in stagnation almost, outside of Ramallah. So the PA's corruption is really high at this moment. Ramallah is a bubble of capitalist investment. So some people are getting really rich on international investment in the government, but everyone else is sort of struggling.
I think knowing that broader context really helps me to understand the Waldorf Hotel better because you can hear kind of the echoes of that capitalist boom in Ramallah in this, right? It's
Yeah.
like there isn't much hope from politics. And so you have some people who are seeing that lack of hope in the political arena and investing their hopes in capitalism and investment instead. And so you can definitely see how a project like this is in line with that kind of displaced optimism, right? So optimism can't go into politics, where can it go? It can go into markets. It can go into building a hotel for tourists to come to Bethlehem and see the
Yeah.
graffiti. Yeah. And at the same time, kind of the ugliness, the bad taste of the sort of whole vibe of the hotel makes sense in a context, or I don't know if it makes sense, but it feels like it fits into a context where things feel really bleak.
Yeah. And the thing that really resonated to me about what you just said is this idea that capitalism will save Palestinians. This idea that it's a capitalist response, it's economic, and not Palestinian struggle or any other form of real material solidarity, but economic uplift by the benevolence of the international market.
Right. It's, benevolent uplift by international investors in Ramallah, benevolent uplift by international graffiti tourists at the Waldorf Hotel.
Yeah. So there's one other art project that we wanted to talk about, and this is Banksy's visit to Gaza in 2015, obviously before the current assault, but after several repeated military incursions from Israel. So this is another Banksy stunt in a way. He snuck in to Gaza because the territory has been under siege since 2006 and really for longer. So it's pretty much impossible to get in or out, but he snuck in via smuggling tunnels, which are how resources get into Gaza. And Israel calls them terror tunnels, but Palestinians wouldn't be able to live without them because basic goods for life are not let in. And he makes a series of paintings around Gaza and also this tourism video, which attempts to paint Gaza as a darkly ironic tourism destination. And I think so. What we should do is I should play the video, but we'll play it on silent and talk over it. The video is captioned, there's no dialogue. So what we'll do is we'll watch it and we'll narrate it for the listener.
Okay.
So let's see. Here we go. So Banksy has these texts, make this the year you discover a new destination. Welcome to Gaza.
I really thought that that was an ad at first.
No. And it shows him coming in through a tunnel, and it says well away from the tourist track, parentheses, accesses via a network of illegal tunnels. And he comes out into this rubble where children are playing. The locals like it so much they never leave, parentheses, because they're not allowed to. It shows some Israeli soldiers milling about, and then it says nestled in an exclusive setting. It shows the wall, parentheses, surrounded by a wall on three sides and a line of gunboats on the other, watched over by friendly neighbors, and it shows all of this destruction from the previous bombing raid. And then it goes on to show some of his art that he's made, and it's like kids, a playground put on a watchtower, a cat drawn to be playing with some rubble as if it's a ball of yarn, and this sort of Banksy-esque thing. So your immediate reactions.
My immediate reaction is that it's so like 2010s irony-pilled internet discourse that it just feels, you know, 10 years on from when this video was made, it feels very cringe, as the kids would say.
It does feel cringe. It does feel very internet irony-ish, I'm smarter, sort of this standoffish, ironic stance really comes through in it. So a critique of this one, I mean, the critique feels sort of obvious. It's really bleak. It's poverty porn in a certain way. But Jennifer Lynn Kelly, in her book about solidarity tourism to Palestine, takes a closer look at it. And one of the things she notes is that we mentioned there's this footage of soldiers, Israeli soldiers milling around. That's not actually in Gaza. That's footage from the West Bank. And so Kelly asks, it's unclear why the West Bank is included in this Gaza montage, perhaps to show the wall, perhaps to show soldiers in repose, perhaps because for Banksy's viewers, Gaza can easily be collapsed into the West Bank. Perhaps the video's creators or Banksy himself didn't recognize the difference between Ramallah and Rafah. So there is a sort of, I think in all of this stuff we're talking about, there is a sort of abstraction, whether it's a Victorian girl with a balloon, like Palestine is never really there in this art, which I think is a curious thing.
Yeah, that is a curious thing. I think it's telling that with every art project that we've discussed, I've needed to ask you to tell me about what was going on in Palestine at the time that this art was made. So the art itself doesn't really give you much of that context and what's happening to people. It feels, you told me earlier about people taking chainsaws and sawing off the wall with the Banksy art on it so that they can have it to sell. And it feels like Banksy's art in Palestine is doing a similar decontextualizing move as the people who would come and saw his art off of
Yeah.
where it was made.
Yeah. And then that critique that he's making his fame off of the suffering of Palestinians has resonance. So one thing I like about Jennifer Kelly's book, I love this book, but one thing I appreciate is that it pairs this Banksy tourism video with a response video that was made by Palestinians, particularly this Gazan parkour team. And so it's a bunch of young parkour athletes who say, Banksy says, "Come to Gaza, let us show you around." And then they go around and they jump off stuff and they do flips. And they're like, "We don't
Oh,
have
that's
very
great.
much stuff, but we're welcome to share it with you. We love having people. We'd love to meet you. We'd love to travel to your country." So it's a totally different vibe. It's the same destruction in the background. And the end of the video, they're doing cartwheels on the beach as bombs blow up in the distance. It's the
Wow.
same sort of situation, except that there are these people who are alive and vibrant and excited. Be
Mhm.
engaging with you is a very different feeling of what Palestine is or what solidarity might look like that comes from these two videos.
Right. The idea that someone would respond to the destruction of Gaza and the desolation that is there with this kind of knowing, ironic pose is
Yeah,
really bizarre, right? Like
yeah,
I cannot imagine any Gazan person describing or not describing. I can't imagine any Gazan person responding to their day-to-day circumstances with a pose of knowing irony.
right.
I can imagine optimism. I can imagine pessimism. I can't imagine the distance from the situation that that knowing little sarcastic edge requires.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. And I think it runs into this common problem. Like if we're talking about the erasure of Palestinians from the art as it's presented, there is a common problem in solidarity. I think even in the present moment where Palestinians are either represented as helpless victims or as terrorists, but never as people who play, enjoy life, share, have families, have agency over their own history. These sorts of things where they're full living beings isn't how they reach us in the West. And this is certainly, I think, the case in this artwork that they're reduced to victims at best.
And they're not really shapers of their own destiny,
Right.
right? In the Banksy solidarity art, it's art that a British man is making for an audience outside of Palestine, right? It's see these people's plight,
Yeah.
do something about it. And in the response video that you told me about, obviously you get a sense of Palestinian people making their own fate, right?
Yeah.
Inviting people to come to their country, seeking out those exchanges that would put them on equal footing with other people and, asserting their own personhood, right? And communicating to us some of
Yeah.
that personhood.
You just reminded me, I don't know if you ever saw these or if I'm just a little bit enough older, but these videos, like I think it was like the World Children's Fund or something, used to show these videos of kids starving in Africa, and they'd be like these videos, please call now, send money. But it's a similar thing. There's no
Mhm.
imagination that people who
Right.
are in these videos have any agency at all. It's just up to you to feel your heart move or not. But
Yes.
it's completely effacing of the people involved.
Right. And in those videos, you also never see children playing, right? They're
Right.
all sort of staring plaintively at the camera
Yeah.
with, with frowns on their faces. Um, yeah.
So I think we want to wrap up by asking a few broader questions like what can we take away from this? And one thing I do want to say, we've been extremely critical of Banksy. And I think, appropriately, these are real concerns with the work, but it is also not that there's like a perfect solution out there of how to do solidarity. And I think solidarity in art is a very difficult thing that is often imperfect. So it also is noteworthy. And I think, I mentioned Shrew Harb's essay earlier. She says she appreciates that attention is being drawn, right? Like there are valuable attempts, noble efforts, which perhaps could be refined or improved upon. But the idea of solidarity shouldn't be thrown out with the bathwater of trying to figure out how to do it in a way that's perhaps more respectful.
Right. Right. And I would take it that little, I don't know if this is really taking it a step further or not, actually. I would just add from where I sit, I think it is better that Banksy did go to Palestine than if he had not gone.
Right.
Right. And I think that what we are pointing to is that whatever our immediate emotional responses of how we might like to be in solidarity with people might not be exactly what they actually need from us.
Yeah. And I think of maybe a takeaway of how, if we're asking what is our critique, one is just if you are doing artistic solidarity, it is important to take the real people into account and to perhaps work together with them instead of putting your own vision on top of the people who are there, which is a hard thing to do, especially for a brand named artist like Banksy.
I think also something that I would add for those of us who are not artists, like I'm not an artist, is that a really important counterpoint to boycott, divestment, and sanctions in terms of things that we in the international arena can do in solidarity with Palestinians. It's also important, I think, for us to view Palestinian art, to read Palestinian literature when we're able to, because it is this really important vehicle for people's humanity to be communicated and recognized. And I think it's really telling that as we were talking and we were looking for, okay, Banksy is showing us an image of Palestine, but it's a limited image. And we were looking for what are some other ways that we can know about Palestine. We turned to Palestinian film, right?
Yeah.
We talked about Omar. We talked about Five Broken Cameras. This is actually the second time today that I'm talking about Five Broken Cameras. And so I think that there's clearly immense value in Palestinian art for its own sake. And one thing that we can do is help to create an international market for that art, those films, those books.
Amen to that. What a great wrap-up sentiment. We should probably wrap up there because this has been a pretty long episode. But thank you everyone for listening. We will be talking more about solidarity and art in Palestine and Israel and all of the other things that came up in this episode in the future. I'm sure these are themes that we'll return to. So if you enjoyed this or found it interesting, please keep listening. Tell your friends, like, rate, review, all the other things that they tell you to do. You've been listening to Bad Art, a podcast about the politics of art in the 21st century. I'm Colin McLaughlin Alcock.
I'm Marielle Grushko. It was great talking to you all. See you next time.
Yeah, thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.